combats that never end. There are two mountains that overlook the Spey Valley, one to the east and one to the west, and a fairy king dwells on each of them. They are both sons of Bera. One fairy king is white and has great fame as an archer. He has a silver bow and arrows of gold, and once a day he shoots an arrow across the strath. The other fairy king is black as the raven, and on his left breast there is a red spot. He has no weapon, yet is terrible in battle because he can make himself invisible at will. When he does so, nothing remains in sight except the red spot. He has great strength, and when he goes against his enemies, he seizes them unawares and throws them to the ground. No matter how well they are armed, his enemies tremble when the invisible fairy comes against them. All they see is a red spot moving about in the air. Now, the white fairy has a fair bride, whose name is Face of Light. It is a great joy to her to wander among the mountains where herds of deer crop the green herbage, and through the strath where cornfields rustle in soft winds and fragrant flowers bloom. The black fairy has no bride, and he is jealous of the white fairy because his days are filled with joy by the beauty of Face of Light. These two fairies have ever been enemies. The black fairy keeps out of sight of the famous archer, fearing his arrows of gold. One summer evening, when the twilight shadows were lengthening across the strath, Face of Light tripped merrily over the grassy banks gathering wildflowers. Silence had fallen on the world. No bird sang, and no wind whispered. The lochs were asleep, and the shrunken river made scarcely a sound louder than the sigh of a sleeping babe. It was no longer bright when Face of Light turned away from it. The black fairy looked out from his mountain home. He knew that the white fairy had lain down to rest, and he watched Face of Light gathering wildflowers. Nearer and nearer she came to his dwelling, and he crept into a deep forest which conceals the entrance to his mountain and waited to seize her. Face of Light, never dreaming of her peril, tripped toward the edge of the forest, and seeing many flowers growing beneath the trees, went in to pluck them. She made the forest bright with her beauty, and the flowers grew fairer as she drew near. Suddenly, a great black hand was thrust out from a thick clump of bushes. The hand seized her, and she shrieked in terror and struggled to escape. The white fairy heard her cries, which pierced the air like the keen long whistle of the curlew. He leapt up and looked forth from his mountain top. In a moment he knew what had happened. Face of Light had been seized by his enemy, the black fairy, who was dragging her to a dark dungeon in the middle of his mountain. The white fairy was unable to go to her rescue for two reasons. Like his dark enemy, he could not pass the utmost limits of his mountain house, and having already shot a golden arrow that day, he could not shoot another until a new day dawned. Night came on, and the black fairy climbed to the top of his mountain where he danced for joy because he had taken captive the bride of his enemy. The white fairy was stricken with sorrow, and when he heard the cries of Face of Light coming from the dungeon, he fell down in a swoon. All night long, Face of Light sobbed and wept, while the black fairy danced on the mountain top and sang songs of triumph. He danced so fast that he raised a wind which swept down the strath and shook the trees from sleep, so that they moaned and sighed all night long. The cries of Face of Light were heard by human beings, and those who awakened said one to another, "Listen to the Hag of Night. How terrible are her cries." Not until dawn began to break did the white fairy recover from his swoon. When the first shaft of grey light pierced the eastern sky, he opened his eyes. Then he remembered his sorrow and wept softly. His tears fell as dew on the flowers and the grass. Weeping, he climbed his mountain and wandered round its crest. His heart was heavy for the loss of Face of Light, and when he listened, he heard her moaning in her dark prison. The black fairy had ceased to dance. He stood upright on the highest point of his mountain house and shouted to his enemy, "Ha! Face of Light is my prisoner." Then suddenly he was silent. He saw the white fairy stringing his silver bow and drawing from his shining quiver a bright golden arrow. "Ha!" cried the black fairy. "Would you dare shoot at me?" "Set free, Face of Light, or I shall shoot," the white fairy answered. His face was white as snow and hard as ice. The black fairy laughed and made himself invisible. Just as the white fairy raised his bow to take aim, his enemy vanished from sight. No part of him could be seen but the great red spot on his left breast, which seemed to float in the air. For a moment the white fairy looked with wonder at the red spot, which grew brighter and brighter. The black fairy laughed and made himself invisible. Just as the white fairy raised his bow to take aim, his enemy vanished from sight. No part of him could be seen but the great red spot on his left breast, which seemed to float in the air. For a moment the white fairy looked with wonder at the red spot, which grew brighter and brighter. His bow was bent, and his golden arrow was held ready for flight. The sound of defiant laughter came down the wind as the invisible black fairy danced with joy on his mountaintop. To and fro swayed the red spot, and the white fairy thought he would shoot at it. His aim was true and his arm was strong. Straight from the bow flew the golden arrow. It darted through the air with lightning speed and struck the red spot, which, be it known, was the heart of the black fairy. A shriek rang out across the strath. It was the death shriek of the black fairy, who fell down on the bare rock and died. His lifeblood streamed forth, and the whole eastern sky was covered with it. In the midst of the redness gleamed the bright golden arrow of the white fairy. No sooner was the black fairy slain than Face of Light was set free. The doors of her dungeon flew open, and she came forth in all her beauty. When she did so, the mountains and the strath were made bright. The river sparkled in the light, and the lochs flashed like burnished silver. All the land was made glad when Face of Light was set free from her dark prison. The slumbering flowers opened their eyes to gaze upon her, and the birds broke forth in merry song, while the white fairy smiled and danced with joy. The black fairy lay dead and invisible on his mountain top until evening came on. Then Bera came to visit him. When she found that her son had been slain, she took from her wallet a pot of healing balsam and rubbed it on his wound. Then she rubbed the balsam on his eyes and lips. When she did this, he came to life and began once again to plot evil against the white fairy and his beautiful bride. This story, which used to be told in Strathspey, is the story of the struggle between darkness and light. The black fairy is night, which begins to make itself invisible at dawn, and the red spot on his left breast is the red light of morning. The golden arrow of the white fairy is the golden shaft of sunlight that darts across the eastern heaven as the sun rises in splendour. Face of Light is the spirit of the river Spey, which is bright in daytime and lost to sight in the darkness of night. When the storyteller says that Face of Light leaves the river, he means that its brightness leaves it when the shadows of night are falling.